Hello, Dr. Tracy Paino again. We're going to be wrapping up our lectures in youth evangelism, talking about telling the message to a new generation. We've talked a lot about evangelism, what evangelism is. We've talked about how to do evangelism. We've heard from other people about creating events, about campus ministry, uh, how to tell the story effectively. But when it really comes down to it, we talk about how we need to know our audience and we need to be able to communicate. And that's the thing about youth ministry is that our audience is always changing. Every generation has some unique features, and there's been a lot of study about different generations and their characteristics and how they respond to different messages or to different stimuli. And the generation of young people that we have today is no different. They're unique in a lot of ways. There's some things that are similar. Teenagers are teenagers. They still go through developmental stages. There's still the physical development. There's the mental and the emotional and the relational and the spiritual developments that happen and that are common for all teenagers and have been for, well, since the beginning of time. But there are also some things that are extremely unique about each generation because of the context that they are raised in and because of society and culture. There are some things that bring some unique characteristics and unique aspects and elements to every generation. Ron Hutchcraft, a youth worker and an author, says this: youth ministry requires the courage to leave your own comfort zone and plunge into the surf and the storm. The rescue effort will take you into places that are not comfortable, into methods that may not be understood, into a youth culture that seems out of control. Anytime that we are going to deal with teenagers and young people as adults, you might have just left teenage years, or like me, it might be a distant memory, those teenage years. But no matter where you're at, when you return, it's kind of like the first time I ever walked back into my high school after I had graduated, walked back into my high school, thinking that I'd be surrounded by those familiar feelings and that familiar, the building was familiar, but everything else had changed. Even though it had only been a short time when I went back, it still was extremely different. You talk to freshmen in college and their experience the first time they go back home and they might attend a football game or a basketball game or hang around some friends that are still in high school, and they think they'll just pick up right where they're at, but then they understand that things are different. Things have changed. And as you get older and older, it becomes almost like a foreign country that you go to when you're dealing with young people. So it's always important to stay up and to stay current. And one of the best ways to do that is hang around young people, whether as a parent or a friend, as a youth worker. Be around young people. Take them out for whether it's a cup of coffee or a soda. Spend time with young people, working with them, getting to know them, listening to them, watching them, observe them. Sometimes it's just going, sitting in the mall and watching young people on a Friday night as they interact. Not being a creeper, but being able just to kind of see how they dress, how they talk, the music they listen to, the things that are influential in their lives. And each generation is unique. As a matter of fact, if we kind of look back, if we kind of do a quick historical review of various generations, we can break it down by generations. There's the builders and the boomers and the busters. That's Generation X, and then you have the millennials, and now you have a brand new generation in our youth group, and you actually have another generation that is kind of just being born right now. That they're going to be the youth group in the next decade or so. And to be able to understand, you can look at it that way, or you can kind of look at it at decades. Let's look at it decades for a moment. Let's go all the way back. Seems like ancient history for some, for me, not so much, but the 1950s. How would I describe them? That was kind of the loss of innocence. The media exposes young people and children to the secrets of adulthood. Neil Postman wrote a book called The Disappearance of Childhood, and it was talking about how the experiences and the way that young people now, after World War II and the building of things like the suburbs and the school systems, begin to expose children to adult type circumstances and situations. And there really was this loss of innocence. You can watch old movies like Rebel with a Cause or Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean, and things like that that kind of show this age of innocence being lost with young people. In the 1960s, you have this loss of responsibility. Of course, you have kind of this social upheaval that happens with the civil rights movement. You have the war in Vietnam. You have the kind of the sexual revolution that begins. And you even have the Jesus movement, the hippie era that happens. But these turbulent times challenge people personal responsibility and what it's like to be an adult for young people. In a lot of ways, they think it's this freedom to be able to do what I want, not be controlled by other people. And there was this loss of responsibility. The 1970s, the loss of authority. Family and social upheaval causes youth to question those that are in authority. The 70s begin with dealing with Watergate, and then you have the energy crisis, and you have a lot of people questioning those who were making decisions and who were trying to lead and direct, and they were questioning that and saying, well, if we can't trust them, who can we trust? So there's this loss of authority. In the 1980s, you have a recession, and you have people, it's not like the loss of hope. Postmodernism becomes predominant. A generation focuses on the here and now rather than the future, because they begin to feel like even as they put things together, they might not have things better or as good as their parents. And so they figure, I might as well get all I can get right now, and become very materialistic. The 1990s is this loss of connection. Now you have relationships changing. Youth culture becomes what one author, Patricia Hearst, in a book called A Tribe Apart, where they become their own, not just generation, but separating from other generations and siloed in many ways, whether that was in school and in churches. So many things are focused just on youth that they become their own entity without much influence on by other generations. Then in the 2000s, you have this loss of trust. Radical individualism, tolerance, and diversity suggest that there are no absolutes. There's no absolute truth. Everything is a relative. So we begin to distrust people and institutions and things that we're told or are questioned. And then that brings us to the 20 teens. And really you have this new generation kind of unpacking the generation that follows the millennials. And there really even now isn't a good name. Sociologists are still kind of all over the place for it. It's called Generation Z. Kind of, if you have Generation X, the generation that followed the baby boomers. The millennials were originally called Generation Y because they followed X. And so this Generation Z, or because this generation is generation that is coming of age and they don't remember 9/11. But what they do remember is the fallout from 9/11. So they're called the Homeland generation, where you have the Homeland Security that is protecting everything from terrorists and from threats that might come from abroad or locally. But you also have people that are more geared towards the safety of their home. So it's called the Homeland generation. Or because of the prevalence of, well, iPhones, iPads, everything it's been called the iGen. MTV did a survey a couple years ago, I think in 2014, and the name that they came up with this new generation called the Founders, which they said because everything in society is in upheaval and going to collapse and implode. This is a generation that's going to put it all back together. So they're called the founders. Then other people call them, these are the cloud natives. This is the generation that follows the digital natives, the millennials, where they grew up with computers and with Google and Facebook and all of that. This generation is growing up with the cloud. Everything is in the cloud. Their lives are in the cloud. So they're called the cloud natives, or the cloud generation. Now, the question that I want to ask you is, what are the defining characteristics of today's youth? Because we can kind of go through those generations or through those decades, and we can kind of pinpoint as we look to the past. But if we're really going to take a message and the message of Jesus Christ and communicate it with today's generation, we've got to figure out who they are. And for you that work with youth leaders, you're on the front lines. You are interacting with them on a regular basis. And who better to define this generation and to help us get a handle on what characteristics are predominant than those people who are day in and day out, week in and week out, living their lives and interacting with this generation of young people? What is it that defines this generation? Here's some defining factors that, just from my observation, from the things that I have read, I'm just going to throw out a few things that I want you to consider. You can push back on maybe our course discussion, whether you think these factors are on point or pointed in the right direction, or if they're way off base, let me know. That's fine. But here are a few things that I would say are defining factors of this emerging generation. First of all, they're image conscious. They understand the importance of presenting the right image. How many times have you heard it say it's going, there's a difference between your Facebook image and real life. We always, our selfies and all the pictures that we post, whether it's on Instagram, Snapchat, any of the social media formats, is very different than real life. Our real life could be really, really boring, but the pictures that we post make things look very exciting. We want to make sure we might take 40 different pictures, and I say we, not me, but young people will take 40 different pictures just to get the right one, to be the right angle, the right facial expressions with the right things in the background to make sure that they present the image that they want to present. And so they have difficulty in real life to communicate in real life, because when you're online and in the cloud, you can kind of craft your response. You can put the image that you want. You can perfect it. You can edit it. You can make sure everything is good before you present it out there for other people to review or for other people to talk about. But in real life, those discussions happening in real time, those images, that becomes much more difficult, but they're very image conscious, and then they become self-conscious. For them, relationships matter, but they have a difficult time understanding relationships because of this whole image thing, and because their relationships a lot of times their conversations are done over text messages before they're ever done even over phone. Now, for us, I would much rather go visit somebody, sit down over a cup of coffee and relate to people. Other generations might be picking up a phone, a cell phone, being able to talk. This is a generation that doesn't even really want to talk in real time. They want to be able to text, and they communicate back and forth through text and through status updates and through forums, much easier than they do any other way. So they find it difficulty to have relationships in real time. And they have difficulty in establishing multiple relationships. It's more like a serial, single, or very few relationships that they can manage at any one time in real time, although they can manage hundreds, maybe even for some thousands of relationships online when they're presenting one message to the masses. They exist in the cloud. Their image exists in the cloud. Their relationships exist in the cloud. Even their knowledge is in the cloud. For them, if they have a question, they go to Google, or they, type it in and they get a response. So memorizing facts and figures doesn't make sense for them. If they want to solve a problem, or if they want to know how to operate, they don't read the instruction books that come with equipment. They'll Google it and watch a YouTube video of how to do the thing. So everything that life for them exists in the cloud. Self-worth is their struggle because of this whole image issue, and because of this difficulty of having relationships in real time. Self-worth becomes a struggle. Also, anesthetic is more important than a cure. They're not real long-term thinkers. Now, of course, that's one of the aspects of just youth, the reality of living in the now and not really being able to have that abstract thinking towards the future. But even more so for this generation, they're not looking for cures to their problems. They're just looking for an anesthetic to help them deal with their problems in the here and now. As far as behavior is concerned, as far as limits are concerned, they know no boundaries. That could be moral boundaries. That could be knowledge boundaries. This is a generation that's been told that they can accomplish anything that they put their mind to, and they have access to the world right at their fingertips, oftentimes through their phones or through their computers or their iPads and things like that they are learning. Even in school, they have access to books. They have access to anything they want to buy, anything they want to get, anything they want to look at. They can get it because they have that access. They know no boundaries. They're looking for meaning, but they're lost in a world of information. And that just adds confusion to the kind of that they're drifting in this sea of information without being able to make much sense of it. So they really are looking for people who can walk alongside them and help them navigate the information and find meaning for their lives. Of course, now matters more than their future. Again, that's that inability to really do some of that abstract thinking, but it's also the inability to be able to put some of the pieces together of all the information that's out there, the puzzle of life, being able to fit it together. So what they realize is going, the piece that I'm dealing with now, the now matters more than the future. So let me just deal with now, because the future is just overwhelming and so far out there, I don't know what's there. Nothing holds their interest for long as a result. And so the very short attention spans, their interests, they realize that reality, they're not going to look for even a career that they're going to be in a lifetime. They're just looking for a career that they can go to that's going to meet their needs right now, whether it's financial needs, whether it's satisfaction, whether it's providing them an opportunity to have the friends that they want and do the activities that they want. Now they'll worry about later, but nothing holds their interest for very long. And so commitment is too risky for them. To be able to commit to something long term carries too much baggage and too many repercussions. Sex for them, sexual identity, gender issue, all of that stuff is very confusing for them. But there are a lot of expectations. They are expected to know about sex. They're expected to accept other people's, whether it's their behavior, it's their identity, it's their preferences. All of this is very confusing to them. They don't really have a handle on their own sexuality, much less that of other people. But the expectations that's placed upon them to not just know about it, but in our culture, it's to be able to experience it. Matter of fact, the message that's given to them is that they should experience as much as possible before they make any kind of decisions about who they are and what they want out of life, what they want out of relationships. And that's unfortunate because they're doing that all without a spiritual or a scriptural foundation. And really, that sums up where they're at. They are post-Christian. I think the millennials were kind of leaning towards being post-Christian. This next generation, Generation Z, is post-Christian. Um, they don't look to the Bible first for answers. They don't look to the church to be a major institution or a major influence in their life first. It's at best an afterthought, and sometimes it's a negative thought because what they've seen is a church that is either too political or is just irrelevant to their circumstances or their situations, that doesn't hold their views. And they see the church as being hypocritical. They see the church as not just being irrelevant, but being wrong, as far as how they match up their value, the cultural values, with the values of the church. And that's because they don't approach it with a biblical understanding. And so there's a real need for them to understand and to be able to even take the information that's in Scripture and be able to apply it to their lives in extremely practical ways, because we're facing a generation that is truly post-Christian. What are some of the connection points for this generation? Let me just mention a few again. This generation being experiential and experimental. They want the experiences. They want to be involved. So for them to sit in a classroom, for them to sit and take notes of a lesson or go through a curriculum, isn't as effective as them rolling up their sleeves and being involved and engaged. So we have to look at ways that if we're going to engage them, if we're going to share the message, we've got to allow that to be experiential, and for them even experimental, trying this and doing this before it's ever going to get here. It's got to start with how they can experience it with their hands, with their feet, with their eyes, with their mind, with their heart. They're self-reliant. Um, and that can be a great asset because they can rise up and they'll do things. It can also be a hindrance, because being self-reliant means that they're not going to put their trust and their hope on any other people. They're not going to look to mentors. They're not going to look at teachers and coaches and pastors and youth pastors as authoritative voices. You've got to prove yourself to them, because for them, there's no higher authority than themselves. I already talked about their image driven. They have a self image that they try to present, and that means they want to be able to wear the right clothes, listen to the right music, talk the right way, have the right morality, and that's not necessarily a biblical morality, it's a cultural morality, but they're very image driven, want to make sure they have the right stuff and right things. They're very individualistic, and they distrust. Um, the highest authority in their lives is their own voice and their own thoughts. If they can experience it, if they think it's true, then it's true. And that's kind of like the next step after this moral relativism of, well, anything is true. Rather than all truth is God's truth, it's my truth is all truth. And that's where they're at, is if they think it's true, then it's true. And you really can't argue them out of that position. You have to be able, through a relationship, you have to model truth for them. You have to live it out before they'll ever buy into it. And there are other connection points. And I'd love to hear from you what you think are the topics or the circumstances or the context that you feel are the best circumstances that can reach this generation. We have to overcome the barriers. We have to understand who they are, and we have to overcome their barriers, and we have to overcome our own barriers. And I want to just highlight here real quick 3 barriers that we have to evangelism, period, and especially evangelism towards youth. And the number one barrier, the first barrier I want to share, is to sharing the gospel message with others, is fear. Now, when I read scripture, especially 1 John chapter 4, verse 18, I see that there is no fear in God. God is love. It talks about how God is love, and there's no fear in God. What I see is that the opposite of love is fear. So often we think the opposite of love is hate. And I think hate and love are so close in emotion that we get that confused. I don't think the opposite of love is hate. I think the opposite of love is fear. That's why there is no fear in God. There's because He is love. And in the same way, we oftentimes allow our fear to um, be a barrier between showing our love for others as well as our love for God and be able to introduce people. We have some common fears. We have the fear of associating with the world, of becoming tainted. We have a fear of being corrupted by the world. We have a fear of harming our reputation if we're hanging out with the wrong people or if we say the wrong things or if we make a mistake. We have a fear of being uncomfortable, of discomfort, uh, to say, I'm not comfortable hanging around people that aren't like me or who talk different or are a different age. We have the fear of failure. Of not being a success in what we do with evangelism. We have the fear of looking like a fool. All those fears keep us from being able to enter the world of young people and sharing the gospel with them. And we have to overcome our fear if we're truly going to share the love of God. And I just ask you, what are some of your fears? If you could sit down, if you could just pause the video and write down, what are you afraid of when it comes to sharing the gospel? Hopefully you sit down and say, nothing, absolutely nothing. But we all have some fears from time to time. Fear of being stupid, fear of looking like an old guy out of date, fear of coming across as not being cool, or it goes on and on and on. Those are probably some of my own. But what are your fears in sharing the gospel? We need to overcome fear. The second barrier is the barrier of broken relationships. We are called to love others. 1 John 4:21. And we need to be able to overcome broken relationships. And that can be anywhere in our sphere of relationships. A author by the name of Oscar Thompson wrote a book called The Concentric Circles of Concern. And there he wrote different circles of influence that we have. And of course, core and right at the target in the middle is that first circle is that circle of ourselves. We influence and we are concerned about ourselves, and that's kind of right there. But then we kind of can move out from there and we have our family and influence. And sometimes we have great relationship with our family. Sometimes there are broken relationships there. And those broken relationships hinder our ability to communicate the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. Moves out. We have our other relatives, more distant. Maybe we're not around them all the time or only see them rarely. Our friends are next circle out. And then, of course, neighbors, people that are in our neighborhood or we go to school with or we work with, our acquaintances, people that we might see, might say hello and wave to. We might not even know their name or just know them on a first name basis. We see them at the coffee shop in the morning or whatever, all the way out to just total strangers. And in each of those circles of concern, those circles of influence, we have barriers when those relationships break down. And I ask again, where does your relationships break down? Is it somebody that's close that you need to go to and establish a right relationship, ask for forgiveness, and try to restore that relationship? Is it further out that you just you don't have a relationship with lost people in your community? You hang around with Christians all the time, which I think you should hang around with Christians. You should build relationships where you can fellowship and be accountable and encourage one another. But you also have to fulfill the Great Commission. So we need to be able to establish relationships that go beyond our Christian bubble. And especially with young people, hopefully the only young people that you associate with aren't just those that attend your church. Where do you have relationships with young people in your community? And where can you have relationships with young people in your community who aren't in your church, who don't follow Christ? That you can be a person of influence in their lives in some way. That circle of concern, you need to restore broken relationships. You need to overcome the barrier of broken relationships and be able to establish relationships in such a way that you can be a person of influence. Um, we make disciples, and there are different stages for making disciples. And in the Thompson's book Concentric Circles of Concern, he talks about 7 different stages that we can come to, that we can overcome these barriers. Stage 1 is ourselves, get right with God. Make sure our heart is right. Make sure we're spending time in relationship with God. We're worshiping, and we're growing and learning from His Word, and we're spending time in prayer, and our own spiritual life is where it's supposed to be. We survey our relationships, our family relationships, our neighbors, our friends, our acquaintances, and even those that are strangers, and we look at the outer parts of that circle, and we survey and say, where are the relationships that need to be mended, and where are relationships that I can establish? Stage 3 is to pray. Pray for relations, pray for new relationships, pray for existing, pray for new relationships, and begin to build bridges. Begin to establish relationship, establish communication, talk to people, just get to know them. Talking about spiritual conversations. How do you start a spiritual conversation with somebody that you're not that familiar with? Is you build a bridge. You get to know them. You ask them questions, find out their name. Where do they go to school? What are their interests, their hobbies? How do they spend their time? Who are their friends? What's their family like? Where do they go to school? Ask them. People love to talk about themselves, but I just ask them questions. And as you begin to ask questions, they'll start asking you questions. And you can get to a point where you're open up the door for a spiritual conversation. Build bridges. Stage 5, show love. Show love by meeting needs. Of course, Jesus Christ tells us the greatest commands to love God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and to love your neighbors yourself. And I love the version of that in the Gospel of Luke. Each of the Gospels share that in some way. And of course, it goes back to the Old Testament and the commands that you shall love. And you have Deuteronomy 6:5. The Jews would pray that several times a day. It's called the Shema. Oh, hear Israel. But in Deuteronomy 6:5, it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul. So when Jesus was asked that question, that was the first one. But in Luke, the story kind of flips. Jesus is asked that question, but he turns it around and he asks the young lawyer who asked the question, well, what do you say? The young lawyer quotes the Shema, love God. And then he quotes another place where it says, and you shall love. Now, interesting, many of the Jews, growing up, you would memorize Torah, you'd memorize the law, and you wouldn't memorize it by chapter and verse. They didn't have chapter and verse. But it'd be certain words that would be hooks for your memory that you would remember. And in Torah, there are 3 commands that begin with the word you, and you shall love. The word is vahavta. And the first is Deuteronomy 6:5, and you shall love the Lord your God. The second is Leviticus 19:18, you should love your neighbor as yourself. So when the young lawyers, he's just quoting the things he remembers, and you shall love God, and you shall love your neighbor. Well, there was a third one that he left off. And the third one we find 2 places in Deuteronomy 10:19 and also in Leviticus 19:35. It says, and you shall love the stranger or the sojourner, the foreigner who's traveling in your land, who is in need. He might need food or hospitality or shelter, housing. You were once sojourners. You traveled in the wilderness for 40 years. So you should show compassion on those who are in need and those who are wandering. And it was interesting in Luke chapter 10 when the young lawyer quotes that, and he asks a follow-up question to Jesus, and he says, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus begins to tell a parable. And this is the genius of his teaching. Is in that parable, he tells a story about a traveler who falls among thieves and is beaten and left for dead. And a priest comes by and a Levite comes by, and each of them pass by on the other side of the road and don't help. But it's actually, here's the irony of it, the twist, it's the foreigner, a Samaritan, who shows compassion and mercy to the beaten traveler. And when Jesus asked, so who was the neighbor? The young lawyer said, it was the one who showed mercy. And of course, what Jesus is doing is you left out the third one. You got the first one, you shall love God. You shall love your neighbor. You got the second one. You left out the third one, and let me tell you a story about it. But it's also only on the lips of Jesus that we have, and you shall love your enemies. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, it says, you've heard it said to love your neighbor, but I say to love your enemy too. And how do we love? We show love by showing compassion. We show love by meeting needs. We show love by seeing somebody that is lost, hurting, beaten up. And we show them compassion, and we reach out and we give out of what we have to help them be restored and point them towards healing and wholeness towards Jesus Christ. We show love by meeting needs. Stage 6 is you make disciples. You help them grow. Now notice, you don't clean them up first, but you begin to make disciples where they're at. And you help point the way to be able to grow. And then at stage 7, he says, then you begin again. It's a big circle. Once you're making disciples, you start making more disciples. How do you start? What's the starting point really for us? I'm going to again look at the Old Testament and look at the example of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, of course, was in exile, and he hears about the condition back in his homeland in Israel, in Jerusalem, and how the temple has been destroyed and the walls are in disrepair. And his response gives us a good pattern of what we should do for the broken down walls in a generation, the brokenness that we see in the lives of people. He really had a 4-step plan to get started to rebuild the walls. And the first was he had a broken heart. Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 4, it says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. We need to pray, and we need to see the hurting condition of people in this generation, and it should break our heart. The things that make God cry should cause us to cry, whether that's the fact that they're lost, the fact that they're hurting, that they're abused, that they're walking away from God, that they're walking in darkness, that they don't know the truth. All these things should break our hearts, and we should weep over them, and we should understand that when we hear these things, that we should be moved, and we should ask God, let me feel what you feel about this generation. The second thing he had was an impassioned prayer. Nehemiah 1:4 continues, for some days I mourned and I fasted and I prayed. We need to mourn the lost. We need to mourn for this generation that isn't turning to God, those that are in this generation that isn't turning to God. We need to fast and we need to pray for them. That's the beginning point. The third step that he had is he had a determined plan. Nehemiah 2:4 says, the king said to me, what is it that you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. He got his answer from God, and then he answered the king. This is what we need to do to repair the walls back in Jerusalem. And the fourth step is he stepped into action. In verse 6 of chapter 2 in Nehemiah, it says, it pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. He went. And I think God's calling us. He needs people to repair the wall. He needs people to reach this generation. He's calling you, he's calling me to be able to step into the gap and be repairers of the breach, to be able to rebuild the walls of the generation and point them towards Jesus Christ. The third barrier to sharing the gospel message is, of course, disobedience. The fact that we are passionate, the fact that we pray, the fact that we understand the issues and the problems, we hear the cry. If we don't respond, then we're being disobedient. We're to love God and carry out his commands. And sometimes that's really hard to do. But we need to be able to follow through. We need, here's some pointers from Scripture. We need to start with love. 1 John 4:7, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. We truly need to ask God that we would have a love and a passion for this generation. We need to go to their world. John 1:14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. It's talking about the incarnation, God becoming man, God becoming one of us. In the same way, God is sending us into the world. He said, I don't want you to be of the world, but you're in the world. And we're in the world to be salt and light. Matthew chapter 5. We're in the world to be the preserving agent. We're in the world to show the way, to be able to be a city on the hill that points the way towards Jesus Christ. We're in the world. We need to go in the world. We need to be incarnational. We need to go to this generation, be where they're at. Go to where they're at. Listen to them. See them. Be broken over it. But then speak into their lives and model for them a better way. And we need to start with their needs. Not our needs, but their needs. Jesus and the Samaritan woman started with, I'm thirsty. But then he saw the woman. He said, you're drawing water. Did you know I can give you a water where you'll never thirst again? A living water. In the same way, we need to listen for the needs of this generation. What are they crying for? What are they asking for? What do they truly need? What are their felt needs? And what are their real needs? And we need to share with them the answer that is found in Jesus Christ. And that's truly the next step, to focus on Jesus Christ. Not make it about me, not make it about them, but make it about Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 2:2, I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. We can do all the good works. We can do all the great programming. We can reach into a generation. But if we don't share the message of Jesus Christ and him crucified, then we've not done our job. We've not shared with them the key element, the key message, that Jesus Christ, that God loved them so much that he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to live, to minister, to teach, to die for us. But he didn't stay in the grave. He was resurrected, and he gives us life, both eternal and abundant. And we need to package it attractively. 1 Corinthians 9, starting with verse 20. You can read through verse 23, but it says, I do this for the sake of the gospel. I do all these things. I am a Jew to the Jews. I am a Gentile to the Gentiles. I'm weak to the weak, and I'm strong to the strong. I do it all so that I can present the gospel in an effective way. In the same way, we need to look at ways that we can package the message of the gospel, not ever compromise it, not ever compromise our walk, not ever compromise the gospel message, but be able to put it in ways where it's attractive to a generation, and where we put it in their language, we put it in ways that they can understand, and where they will be compelled, be drawn toward the message of Jesus Christ. How do we do ministry? Let me just give you, and I want to end with this. Author Don Miller, a few years ago in Catalyst Monthly, gave us 13 different paradigm shifts for the future that we should consider. And I think he was pretty right on most of them. But let me throw them out. Let me give them to you and ask you, are these things that make sense and would help you to understand, if you understand these paradigm shifts, how do they impact how you can share the gospel with this generation? Here they are. First of all, to recognize that other people exist. It's not a Christian world out anymore. We might call ourselves a Christian nation in the United States, but it really isn't. The whole cultural changes and shifts that have happened have made us materialistic, individualistic, and not at all dependent upon the gospel and dependent upon on a biblical worldview. We have a self worldview, and the ruler of this world is ourselves, not God, in that view. But we have to recognize that there are other people outside the church that exist, and that if we're only packaging the message to people that people in the church will understand and be attracted to, then the world isn't going to pay attention to us. Second, nobody will listen to you unless they know you like them. And so rather than being angry with the world and the way things are, we need to be able to tell the world that we like them, that not just like them, we love them, that God loves them, that God's not mad at them, but that He wants them to to know Him and to be in relationship with Him. And nobody will listen to God unless they know God loves them. Other people have morality and values. It might not align with ours, it might not align with God's word, but they have a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And we need to understand that. We need to ask questions and find out where they're coming from, find out where they're at so that we can reach them and move them towards a biblical worldview and a biblical morality. We need to find common ground. We need to find common language that we can talk about, define terms in their language, not teach them Christianese or our Christian words, but find out what would minister and what would speak to them in their language. Telling somebody about the gospel is about them, not about us. And so we need to make sure that when we're telling the gospel story and we're telling the story of Jesus Christ, that we put it in terms that they understand, but we put it in their world, in their field of experience, because it's about them responding to the gospel message. And don't let spreading the gospel feel any different than telling somebody about a love in your life, about your children, about your adventures, about a great memory that you have. It should be natural. It should be natural to be able to share the greatest thing that's happened in your life, a faith and a relationship with Jesus Christ, what difference He's made in your life. Include lost people in your community, in your friends, in your circle of friends. Reach out and build those relationships so that you can, again, be a discipler, be an evangelist, build relationships with lost people. You need to apologize for what you represent to them. In many ways, the church and Christianity have a negative view in today's culture. And for some of this stuff is well deserved. We should apologize. We should apologize for the way we've treated certain people, or we've cut them off, or we haven't listened to their needs, and we've let them hurt, and maybe even hurt them worse and abuse them. We need to apologize for some of that, and then point them in a right direction and say, realize that that was human error. It wasn't God's error. We need to be authentic. We need to be ourselves. We need to be real with people. Don't try to put on masks and be fake and be holier than thou. Let people see us, warts and all. We need to pray for the salvation of others. And I think been encouraging you through this semester to make evangelism part of your prayer life, part of your prayer list. And I think that should continue even after this course is done, that you pray for evangelistic opportunities. You pray for divine moments. You pray for spiritual conversations, especially for young people. And don't be afraid to ask people if they'd like to know Christ. Not just know about Him, but to truly know Him. And if they wonder what's that like, then that gives you an opportunity to share your story, to be able to share your story with a new generation. And that's what evangelism is. It's sharing God's story through your story so it becomes their story. It's bringing people one step closer to Jesus Christ.